Welcome to the first in Lakes Alliance's Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science Cafe of the year. So first of many to come, and great speakers lined up for you this year. I'm Colleen Johnson from Johnson Financial Group, Johnson Bank. We've been proud sponsors for years, since the beginning probably. I'm also a community board member, executive member, finance committee, golf committee, you name it, right? So proud to be involved. And you know, as I was coming in downtown, I work downtown, and every day I come downtown, down John Nolan, I'm just reminded every day of just in awe of how beautiful our lakes are and how important they are to our Madison, to our city, right? And so thank you for everyone being here this morning. It's great to see you all. It's great to see people being advocates for our lakes in whatever capacity you are able to do so. Thank you. Along with Johnson Financial Group, we have our hosting sponsor, the Edgewater, beautiful place, the University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and media partner Isthmus, supporting sponsor National Guardian Life Insurance Company, and First Weber Foundation. Johnson Financial Group is proud to once again be a presiding sponsor at Yahara Lakes 101 Science Cafe. We have a couple quick announcements before we get our speaker and our event started. First, don't let the lack of ice on the Lake Mendota fool you. It is winter, and which means that Frozen Assets Festival is right around the corner. We are always looking for great volunteers, so if you're out and about and you want to be part of it, feel free to reach out to any of these great individuals or online. Happy to have you volunteering. This year, we have a full slate of weeknight events leading up to the community-wide free family festival on Saturday, February 8th. So I believe there's more information on your table tents and online, so feel free to check that out. On Monday, especially February 3rd, we have one of the events will be especially for the Yahara Lakes 101 Evening Edition, titled Women in Water and Sustainability, which will feature a panel discussion by 3 women in that field, and as well as an opportunity to network. So come join us for that. Second, it's start of the year, which means it's time to renew your individual, friend, and business lake partner donations. Friends and lake partners make donations outside of events or sponsorships and help fund important lake improvement projects, educational programming like the Yahara Lakes 101, and citizen monitoring. So thank you for your donations in the past. Look forward to continuing involvement going forward. Friends and lake partners receive many benefits, including free attendance to the Yahara Lakes 101 events that you are attending this morning. So feel free. We have an exciting lineup this year, like I mentioned, for the breakfast series. So I'd love to see you at all of them. Today, though, we're going to be learning about muck. Right? My favorite wonderful word, muck. More specifically, it's really what sediment cores taken from the Wisconsin lake can tell us about the lake history and changes over time. So the muck can tell us a lot. But here to tell us a little bit more about today's speaker and topic is Julie Bauer from Algae Energy. So thank you, Julie. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As Colleen mentioned, and thank you, Colleen, I'm Julie Bauer. I'm the Executive Director of the Algae Energy Foundation, and it is great to be back here with all of you this morning. Algae Energy is a proud lake partner of Clean Lakes Alliance and happy to sponsor this month's Yahara Lakes 101. The Algae Energy Foundation also sponsors great Clean Lakes Alliance events such as Frozen Assets, and as Colleen mentioned, that is just right around the corner, as well as the community breakfast that is in May. Additionally, Alliant Energy proudly gave Clean Lakes Alliance a $100,000 challenge grant last year to help with its Protect, Restore, Preserve Fund, which is being used to improve newly purchased land for Pheasant Branch Conservancy. So we were very excited to be a part of that project. A little bit more about the Allied Energy Foundation. In 2019, the foundation, our employees, our company gave over $7 million to various programs, activities across Wisconsin and Iowa. So we're proud to be here, and it doesn't just stop with the check. Our employees are very generous with their time, and in fact, many of them have worked with the Clean Lakes Alliance Group on many different projects, and we're proud to be a part of all of that. Today's talk, I love this title, History in the Mucking. Our presenter, Paul Garrison, will show us how water quality has changed in Wisconsin lakes over time by looking at sediment core samples. Specifically, how water quality has changed since the influx of European immigrants over 150 years ago. A little bit more about Paul Garrison. He's retired from the Wisconsin DNR after a 39-year career as a water research scientist. His research was concentrated on lakes with a specialty in using sediment cores to reconstruct water quality history. In retirement, besides helping educate all of us, Garrison also works part-time for an environmental consulting company doing lake management planning. So with that, please join me in welcoming Paul Garrison.
I tried doing this down there. I'm not kind of close to see these. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. For the next few minutes, we'll actually do a bit of a history lesson. As Julie mentioned, I'd like to talk about sort of the history of water quality changes that we've seen in lakes in Wisconsin. I'll give you a few case studies. None of them will specifically be on Lake Mendota, but there'll be things that are very applicable to what we've seen for changes in Lake Mendota and what the causes have been. As you can see, there have been a number of potential changes in land use in Wisconsin lakes. These are just two examples, changes in agriculture, shoreline development. And the way that we can sort of get an idea of what these changes have been, or we take sediment cores. This is an example of sediment core we've taken. This lake actually was in Michigan. So what we'll talk about today, and start with, the word for the day is paleoecology. Paleoecology means essentially the history of ecology, more specifically the history of lake science, the history of lakes that we'll see in Wisconsin lakes. Talk about why do we take sediment cores. Specifically, we take sediment cores because unlike well, the information we have from Lake Mendota, most lakes we have very limited long-term data. Mendota is an exception. We have actually over 100 years of some kinds of lake science data from the lake. But most lakes don't. But fortunately, a number of processes, things that have occurred in the lake are actually recorded in the lake sediments. There'll be fossils of certain types of algae. There'll be chemical markers and other things like that. So we're able to reconstruct the water quality history of the lake and to certain aspects the ecology of the lake from what we find in the sediment. So we take sediment cores. I'll show you an example of how we do that. But essentially, we just somehow get a plastic tube into the bottom to collect the sediment. And then I'll give examples of different land uses in the watershed, how they have impacted the lakes. And then at the end, we'll talk about what about climate change, potential impacts we might see from climate change, or have we seen from climate change in our lakes. So essentially, as I mentioned, we just need to get a plastic tube somehow into the bottom of the lake to collect the sediment. One example, this is a gravity core. This is actually we used on Green Lake, in Green Lake County. Oops. Oh, okay. Another way that we frequently do is a piston core. This actually, we have aluminum rods, we push this into the core. This example, this is actually a core that we took on Isle Royal to look at changes in mercury deposition over the last couple hundred years. We don't normally use float planes to collect the lake cores, but in this case, this is the best way to do it. We've collected cores through 2011 over 168 lakes across the state. We're actually at this point well over 200 lakes that we've taken sediment cores from. Did you notice that there aren't lakes in the southwestern part of the state? And you may or may not know, this was an area that was not glaciated, and so there are very few natural lakes. And typically we take sediment cores from more natural lakes. So this is an example of a piston core. They're just a plastic tube. You get an idea how long that is. We push this plastic tube into the lake bottom and collect sediments. In this case, this is from Shell Lake in the northwestern part of the state. But this core was about 5 feet long. There's ways that I'll talk about in a minute to get an idea how far back in time that goes. And then we need to extract that core, and we section it in different slices, usually 1 to 2 centimeter intervals. We take the sediment, collect the sediments then, and put it in this case in plastic bags. There's 2 types of cores that we typically do, and one is called a full core, and in that case, we keep all the sections. We don't necessarily analyze all the sections, but we would analyze typically 15 to 20 sections throughout the core. We've done a lot more of these, what we call top-bottom cores. You get much less information from that, but essentially we can use these top-bottom cores to compare water quality at the present time to what it was at a reference site, which typically we want to be back at least 200 years ago, because that's before European settlers arrived on the scene and had their impacts. Top-bottom cores are much cheaper and quicker to do than full cores, but full cores, which is results I'll talk about mostly today, we get much more information. For example, in this case, we can get an idea of the sedimentation rate and changes over time. So one question we always have is, how old is the sediment at different slices within the core? And the way we typically determine that is through lead-210 dating. Lead-210 is a special isotope of lead. It's actually a very small part of the total lead that would be in the sediments. But it works very well for our purposes because lead-210 originally comes from uranium-238. It's a special isotope of uranium. As that degrades, it degrades into radium, which both of those have pretty long half-lives, over 1,000 years. But radium, as it decays, goes to radon, which is a gas. It has a very short half-life, and since it's in a gaseous phase, it goes into the atmosphere, where it quickly degrades to lead-210. And then this lead-210 falls onto the lake bed. Lead-210 has a half-life of a little over 22 years, which means if you start with 100 parts, in 22 years, you'll be down to 50 parts. In another 22 years, you'll be down to 25 parts. But essentially what that means, by knowing how much lead-210 there is at these different slices, we can determine the date of when these sediment was deposited, and we can get information also like sedimentation rate. Because of its half-life, it goes back about 130 to 150 years, which actually in our case works very well, because that's about how long European settlers have been in the upper Midwest. I've done a few cores from the state of Vermont, and their settlement history is quite a bit longer than ours, so it doesn't work as well for the older deposition, but this is very typically what we use to determine sediment dates for our lakes. Lead-210 like anything, you know, there's always some uncertainty involved. And so we try to find ways to sort of check our calculations to see if those dates really look reasonable. And one that we can use is cesium-137. Cesium-137 was a byproduct of atmospheric nuclear testing. So let me show you what these are depth in the sediment core down here, and this is the concentration this way. We'll see a lot of graphs like this. Well, the U.S. started atmospheric nuclear testing in 1954. So if you see a cesium profile like this, where it starts to increase, that date should be about 1954. Then the Russians started doing atmospheric testing, and their bombs were much dirtier than ours, and so they put a lot of cesium into the atmosphere. But then in 1963, the Atmospheric Nuclear Test Ban Treaty went into effect, which outlawed atmospheric testing. And so this peak we see in cesium then is 1963. So ideally, when the lead-210 would say that this slice was deposited in the 1960s, it would agree to where we see the cesium peak. If we were in Northern Europe, we would have a much higher peak up here, which was a result from the Chernobyl accident. Very little of that cesium made it over here, so we can't really detect it. But in Northern Europe, it's a very strong signal. A couple other localized ones we can use in southern Wisconsin, especially southeastern Wisconsin, in the 60s and early 70s, they added sodium arsenite as a way to control macrophytes or aquatic weeds. And there's records of how much arsenic they added in which years. So if we do an arsenic profile, then we know in this case, the peak application of sodium arsenite in this lake was 1962. So we can use that to kind of check the dates. Throughout the state, we can use stable lead. Now this is very different than lead-210. We're looking at stable lead, and this was up through the mid-1970s, was found in gasoline. But it was, they stopped making lead in gasoline in the 1970s, so this peak in stable lead corresponds to about 1975. So one of the main tools that I use to reconstruct water quality history is actually an algae called diatoms. These are specialty algae that are very useful because they have shells made of silica, which is the same main ingredient in glass. So this means that after they fall to the bottom and die, their fossils are preserved for hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. And if you get an idea from just looking at the stylized picture of the diatoms, they have lots of different shapes and sizes. And they also have, many of them have very narrow environmental requirements. Some like high phosphorus, some like low phosphorus. Some grow attached to macrophytes, lake sediments, or they float around in the open water. So by looking at changes in the diatom community in these cores, we get an idea of, for example, changes in phosphorus. We can use them to look at changes in pH. We can look at changes in chloride deposition. They're responsive to that. There's a whole host of inferences we can make from changes in the diatom community. So this is actually not what we see under a microscope. This is closer to what we see. This would be what we would see in a live diatom. These are chloroplasts that are inside. And this is actually scanning electron micrographs of diatoms from Geneva Lake sediment core that we worked on. So again, you can see the different shapes and sizes, and they've proven to be very useful. So just sort of reiterate, why do we really care about phosphorus? I'm sure you've heard lots of things about control for phosphorus. Well, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the big controversy was what was controlling algal blooms that they were seeing, especially along the Great Lakes. Was it phosphorus? Was it carbon? Was it nitrogen? Especially the soap detergent industry had an economic interest in it not being phosphorus. So in Western Ontario and Canada, in the experimental lakes area, they put a curtain across the narrows in this lake, and on both sides they added carbon and nitrogen, and on this side they added phosphorus. And you can kind of see this is greener here, but a close up, this is the phosphorus side. So clearly phosphorus is what was controlling the algal growth, and that pretty much put that argument to rest. So that's why we were very concerned about phosphorus. So what I want to talk about for the next few minutes are some case studies, specific cores that we've taken from lakes that have different land uses in their watershed, and give you an idea of what kind of impacts we see from these different land uses. We'll talk about agriculture. Of course, that's very important in Wisconsin lakes, Wisconsin in general. We'll talk about the impacts that we see from early logging. As you're aware, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in central and northern Wisconsin, there was very large logging operations. So what impact did those have on lakes? Now a very important issue is shoreline development. We'll talk about that. And lastly, we'll talk about climate change. So agriculture, since the late 1800s, practices have really changed a lot. Initially, it was more sort of subsistence farming, growing enough to just survive on from year to year. As we progressed through time, tractors became more powerful. Equipment, they were able to turn over more land. They were able to produce enough crops to sell. So as you can imagine, this very likely had a lot of impact on land use, phosphorus sediment running off from the landscape, and we'll look at how that has affected the lake. First lake we'll talk about is Green Lake. This lake is a large lake. It's not as large as Lake Mendota, but it's a very large lake. It's the deepest natural lake in the state. It's not the deepest lake in the state. Lake Wazee, which was an old iron mine near Black River Falls, is the deepest lake, but Green Lake was the deepest natural lake. So I don't expect you to read all this, but essentially the browns and the light greens, this is all agriculture. So you can see a large part of this lake's watershed was in agriculture. This is actually the city of Ripon, which discharges into Silver Creek, which eventually flows into Green Lake. So this would have some of an impact, but most of the watershed was in agriculture. So there's some of the chemicals I haven't talked about, but there's some chemicals that we find in the lake sediment that we can use to reconstruct changes that happened in the watershed. And one of the ones that we're able to use is titanium. Titanium is useful because it's only found in soil particles, especially with clays. So if there's been changes in the deposition of titanium, this tells us there's been a change in soil erosion and sediment entering the lake from the watershed. So in the case of Green Lake, and this is very typical in many lakes that have a lot of agriculture in the watershed, is that deposition or soil erosion from the landscape began increasing, especially starting in the late 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, primarily because, especially following World War II, tractors became much more powerful. They were able to plow more land. They were able to farm more land in a year. This led to a lot more sediment being run off from the land into the lake. But then in the 1960s, 1970s, the Soil Conservation Service really had a strong program to reduce the sediment delivery. And in the case of Green Lake and many other lakes, it actually was very effective in reducing soil loss. They kept the soil on the land, it didn't run into the lake. Now that's not to say that currently sediment entering the lake is at a lower rate than it was historically, but it certainly is better than it was in the 50s and 60s. But following World War II, there was a very large increase in the use of commercial fertilizers. And primarily this was because during the war, there were a number of factories that came into being to produce gunpowder for the war effort. Well, after the war, they were looking for ways to utilize those factories, and it turns out it's not a very much changed from making gunpowder to making fertilizer. And so then once they had this fertilizer, there was a big marketing to use it on the landscape and increase agriculture productivity. So one of the things that's in the phosphate ore that is mined to get fertilizer is uranium. It's in very small amounts, but that means we can use uranium as a tracer for fertilizer. So what we see in Green Lake is even though the sediment delivery to the lake has gone down starting in the 70s, the fertilizer application is going up, and another way to say it is that there's still a lot of phosphorus coming into the lake. Even though we reduce the sediment and phosphorus is associated with the sediment, that rate has declined. The fact that we're adding all this commercial fertilizer, a lot of it runs into the lake. And this is the case, what we see in Lake Mendota, or in Green Lake, and we've also, of course, not that I've taken, but other people have taken, show the same trend in Lake Mendota. So another thing we can use to get a chemical we can use to get an idea of what's happening in the lake is manganese. And manganese changes in response to how much oxygen is in the deep waters of the lake. And so what we see in Green Lake is that we initially had an increase in sediment, and we get an increase in phosphorus being delivered to the lake. We're losing oxygen at a greater rate in the deep waters of the lake. So this has had a negative impact from all this phosphorus coming in. And then we can also use the diatoms to estimate actual phosphorus concentration in the lake. And what we see, this is a core that we took from the western basin and one from the eastern basin, and they show that in the 40s and 50s, the phosphorus concentration of the lake began to increase in response to more sediment. It's continued to increase because of all the commercial fertilizer that's been applied. This decline here is partially because the city of Ripon upgraded their sewage treatment plant, so they were putting less phosphorus in. But in more recent years, we see a further increase in phosphorus, primarily from the use of fertilizers in the watershed. Next lake I want to talk about is Lake Ripley. Since Paul Dearlove invited me, he said I have to talk about this lake too. No. Actually, I've taken 2 cores from this lake. This lake is in just outside the city of Cambridge, just east of here. It's a much smaller lake. It's about 400 acres and it has a maximum depth of about 44 feet. This lake was of interest initially because in the 1990s, the Department of Ag and Department of Natural Resources had a program known as Priority Watersheds. In that case, they would take lakes and they would also go streams and rivers, but in my case, lakes that had a fair amount of pollution coming into the lake, especially phosphorus, and it was ways to do stuff in the watershed to reduce the phosphorus. In the case of Lake Ripley, there was quite a bit of agriculture in the watershed. So initially, I took a core to see if, in fact, agriculture was the main reason that the lake had degraded. Which it turned out it was. And then, so they did a number of stuff in the watershed. They had some wetlands that they had channeled. They essentially broke those tile lines, so those wetlands no longer were part of the watershed. They did some stream bank improvement. They did no-till conservation farming in the watershed to reduce phosphorus and sediment. So then Paul had me take a core in the late 1990s to see, in fact, if the lake had gotten better by doing this. So this is the sedimentation rate over time in Lake Ripley. You can see initially in 1900, we see an increase in the sedimentation rate or the infilling rate of the lake, which is probably due primarily to some increased agricultural use, but also about this time there were hotels and resorts that were built on the lakeshore. This was a popular place for summer visitors from Milwaukee and Chicago area. In 1940, we see the highest sedimentation, and this was because they actually channelized part of the creek that comes into Lake Ripley, so they straightened it. Well, when they did that, they stirred up a lot of sediment, which it washed down from the stream and into the lake. But as you can see, it was the sediment deposition is fairly short-lived. And then, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, this was a priority watershed. There were some DMPs done in the watershed. And in fact, you can see the sedimentation rate has declined since that. So, if nothing else, this work in the watershed reduced the amount of sediment coming into the lake. And this is our friend titanium again. This is indicative of soil erosion. Mirrors much what we saw with the sedimentation rate. And this is phosphorus with concentration in the lake itself as estimated from the diatom community. And it's not surprising, after in the early part of the 20th century, there's an increase in phosphorus in the lake in response to agriculture in the watershed. It remained elevated from 1940 into the 1990s, and then when they did that work in the watershed, the phosphorus levels actually went down. So the bottom line was that this work that was done in the watershed was very successful in reducing sediment delivery to the lake and reducing the phosphorus concentration of the lake. So early logging, how much of an impact did that have on our lakes? Well, it turns out it actually had very little impact on the lakes. And if you think about it, when they do the logging, even with clear-cut logging, I mean, you change the terrestrial landscape tremendously, but within a year or so, you get lots of vegetation that grows up. And so that vegetation keeps the soil in place. So even though the land looks much different than it did before, it really means there's not a lot of phosphorus that gets delivered from the logging. We see maybe some impacts for 5 years at the most, but there were logging and then often there were fires in these watersheds, but overall there actually was very little impact from the sort of logging. One thing that's become very important, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, is shoreline development. So we'll look at what impact this has had on our lakes. There have been a lot of changes in the types of structures around the lakes. In the 1940s, 1930s, cottages tended to be smaller, which meant there was much less impervious surface for water to run off. Lawns weren't maintained like they frequently are now. And quite often, these cottages were only people that were in them for 2 or 3 months a year, where now more frequently people are there year-round. And also, we see a lot of changes on the shoreline from the 1940s to the more present time. This is a picture taken on the shore of Berry Lake, up near Shawano Lake in Oconto County, and we'll talk more about Berry Lake later. This is 1940. This is a home in the same area in 2009. So you can see, even just looking at that, the habitat has really changed a lot. This has had an impact on phosphorus and sediment running off from the nearshore area, as well as major impacts on wildlife, birds, amphibians. In 1990s, this was certainly a concern at DNR, and one of the staff there, John Panuska, put together a modeling effort to try to get an idea of how much impact we were getting from shoreline development on lakes. So he took, quote-unquote, sort of normal shoreline home. It's got 100 foot of frontage in this case. And he looked at how much water, how much sediment, and how much phosphorus we would expect to come off from a natural site in the 1940s and one, in this case, in the 1990s. And if you look at how much water, there's really not a lot of difference between undeveloped in the 1940s. It's because there wasn't as much impervious areas. There was not a lot of developed lawns. There were more natural vegetation. But then in the 1990s, where we have much bigger structures, we have maintained lawns, we get a lot more water running off. We do see some increase to sediments in the 1940s. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But in the 1990s, we see a lot more sediment that comes off from these areas. And a lot of this has to do because there's a lot more water running off. And then for phosphorus, there wasn't a lot that came off undeveloped in the 1940s, but in more recent time, we get a lot more phosphorus running off. And again, a lot of this is because we get so much more water coming off. The concentration of phosphorus actually isn't that much higher, but the fact that there's so much more water pushing it out, that the load of phosphorus increases a lot. One thing that I had noticed in a number of my sediment cores from this part of the state, from the northern part of the state, is that when you first have some development in the watershed, there seemed to be a change in the diatoms that grow attached to bigger plants. And I sort of hypothesized why that might be, but in the 2000s, Susan Borman did a very elegant study looking at macrophyte communities, aquatic plant communities from the 1930s and what they were at the present time. In the 1930s, there were certain parts of the state had some very detailed, very accurate macrophyte surveys done. So she was able to compare changes in the plant community from the 1930s to what they are at the present time. And what she found was that many of these lakes were in the northwestern part of the state, I should mention. These were seepage lakes. These are lakes that don't have streams coming in or out. They're sort of self-contained lakes. Many of these lakes had macrophyte communities or plant communities like this, very low growing, don't have much leaf surface area. But with development, this is what more often than not she saw, is that you get much bigger plants, you have a lot more plants growing, and this is sort of what I was seeing in my sediment cores. I was getting an indication of this, but this directly showed that this is what had happened in a number of these lakes. And so if you remember, in the 1940s, we had some additional sediment coming into the lake. And so what we think happened is that as the sediment came in from construction of these cottages, it deposited in the nearshore area, which typically were sort of sandy. Now you have more silty sediment. This allows bigger plants to establish themselves. They can grow in the sediment where they couldn't grow in the sand. And once these plants are there, they accumulate even more sediment. And so the bottom line is we've seen really big habitat changes from these cottage development. These are sediment cores we took in the nearshore area at Comfort Lakes. So you can see there's sort of more organic matter on top of, in this case, marl. This is sand, the organic matter. So this is the more sediment that washed in from construction. So there's more silty sediment now than there was historically, which is associated with these large plants. But how it's, we've seen from the modeling that additional phosphorus is coming into the lake from shoreline development. So, but do we actually see this in the lake? So I took a number of sediment cores in northern lakes, and this would be the background concentration. So this is before there was any development. And this is what we see now. So actually, we don't see much of an increase in phosphorus in shoreline development in the lake itself. Well, how can that be if the modeling indicated that there should be a lot more coming in? And the reason is we have these increased large plants, aquatic macrophytes. They have a lot of algae attached to them, specifically diatoms. Well, when these diatoms grow and the other algae attached, they get their phosphorus from the water column. The plants themselves get the phosphorus from the sediment, so they're not taking it out. But essentially, all this periphyte and attached algae growing to these plants, larger plants, is absorbing the phosphorus. That's why we don't see more phosphorus out in the open water. Now, what we've seen in southern lakes where they've had a lot more development in the watershed, eventually you can overwhelm this sort of buffering of phosphorus in the plants, and then you will get more phosphorus in the open water. It's similar to what we saw in Green Lake. So, but really the biggest change that we see in our lakes from shoreline development is habitat change. So, the last two examples I want to see is some potential things we might see impacts from climate change. I didn't mention earlier, but most of our lakes are about 13,000 years old because that's when the glaciers receded. But primarily, my sediment cores have been interested in the last 200 years, as I mentioned because that's when European settlers arrived. But in the case of Max Lake, this was a lake that I'd done some work on during acid rain studies, and I knew that this lake naturally had a low pH. It was about 5 to 5.5. It's a seepage lake, means there's no streams coming in or out. So I took a sediment core because we know that from pollen studies, pollen that are found in trees and grasses, that had been done, work that had been done here at the university, we know that roughly 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, or 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, the climate in the upper Midwest was warmer and apparently drier than it is now. So we took a sediment core in this lake to get an idea of how that climate change that happened in the upper Midwest then, which is similar to what models have predicted might happen here in the next 50 to 100 years. We wanted to see how this lake responded to that. So in this case, we took a core all the way to the bottom of the lake, which in this case was about 4.5 meters. So this, and when we do take these long cores like that, we can't do it all in one drive. We have to, so we took a core, this core, and then we had to take another one in the same hole to get this. So essentially we had 4 cores, and you could sort of put these together. This would stack on top of this one, and this one would stack on top of this one. So one thing to notice is at the bottom, this is sort of more clay, fine silt that washed into the lake as the glacier was receding. It's sort of a reddish-brown color. And in this case, we can't use lead-210 to date it. We use carbon-14, which they will go back tens of thousands of years. And so the other thing I want to point out is that if you look at this core, you can see there's some striation through it. You don't see that in these 2 cores. So you notice this white band here, and there's another one up here, and we'll talk about those a little bit. But clearly there have been changes. This lake operated differently in this time period than it did in these 2. This is more typical of what you would see in northern seepage lakes. So this was actually very surprising just to look at it that way initially. So with the carbon-14 dating, the bottom of the cores were about 13,000 years ago. Then the top of this one was 11,300 years ago. And these bands, it turns out, this is about deposits about 10,000 years ago, this one about 6,000 years ago. And then these are the dates for other parts of the core. This, of course, would be like 2010. So what we know from acid rain studies is that if you have a lake that has streams coming into it, there's a fair amount of buffering that's in these streams that they get from the surrounding landscape. Even though it may be sand, there's a certain amount of buffering chemicals like calcium that's deposited. So that raises the pH. So it turns out that historically, before this warming period 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, this was actually a drainage lake, even though it's a seepage lake now. And then for the last 6,000 years, it changed to a seepage lake. So when we had that warming period, the lake actually, in a sense, sort of dried up to a certain extent. And it changed from a drainage lake to a seepage lake, which has large ramifications for the pH of the lake. It also has ramifications for the biota, specifically fish. And this area in here was kind of a transition period. Initially, the pH went down, and it was more like a seepage lake, but then we had a couple times when we apparently had some flood events that entered the lake. And it turned out those 2 white bands, this one, which is about 10,000 years ago, and then the one more recent is this peak here. So it looks like what happened in this lake, that initially it was a drainage lake, water levels were higher, and then periodically we would have flood events. I looked at the diatom community, both in that white band here and here, and the diatoms were pretty badly fragmented, indicating that they were produced under kind of high energy events, probably some flooding events. So what we hypothesized, this is what the landscape was like 7,500 to 12,000 years ago. This is Trout Lake. And Max Lake, which is this one here, was probably part of Trout Lake at one period, that period of time. And this area here was probably also underwater. It's not anymore. So this warming period looks like it had a profound effect on a number of these small lakes, and it's likely there's a number of other situations like that also. The last lake I want to talk about is Berry Lake. I mentioned this briefly earlier. Berry Lake is about 200 acres. It has a depth of maximum depth of about 27 feet. But it's another seepage lake, and it undergoes tremendous water level changes. This is a period in the 1930s when the water levels were low, but often at high water levels we'll have water all the way up to here. Dr. Samantha Kaplan at UW-Stevens Point took a core in this lake, went all the way to the bottom like we did in Max Lake. And so I want to talk about her results for a minute, but take a step back. This is a contour or a terrain map of this area. This is Berry Lake here, so you can see it kind of a depression. But you notice these hills here. These are actually ancient sand dunes. As the glacier was receding, the atmosphere was cooler, and it was also very windy in front of the glacier front. And northern Wisconsin, as you may know, has lots of sand. And a lot of this sand, it turned out, was blown from northern Wisconsin down to this area and formed these sand dunes. Of course, they're wooded hills now, but these are results from sand dunes. And in the sediment core, we can actually see that. This is that red clay that we saw on the bottom of Max Lake, but then there's this large deposition of sand. The other thing to notice about this core compared to Max Lake total sediment was about 4.5 meters. Turned out in this lake, it's a little over 1 meter. So there's much less sediment has been deposited in this lake over the last 13,000 years. Why is that? Well, we did the carbon-14 dating, so this is about the same time period that we see the red clay in Max Lake. So we had sand blowing in this lake for over 1,000 years, almost 1,200 years. And then we get typical lake sediment here throughout this. So this date is a little over 11,500 years. The bottom of this core, it's only 3,000 years. So it turns out during this middle period, what we call the Holocene, 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, this lake apparently dried up. Even though now it's roughly 27 feet deep, this lake apparently dried up, and a lot of the sediment probably blew away, it went away. So unlike Max Lake, this lake didn't change from a drainage lake to a seepage lake. This actually failed to become a lake. It dried up. So then these are the dates for the rest of this. So in summary, what I hope that I've showed you today is paleoecology tells us about the changes that have occurred in a lake and is able to suggest what are the major causes for those changes. Is it nutrients that come from agriculture? There's other, I didn't mention this, but there's certain markers for urban runoff. For example, zinc that we can use. Agriculture has had a large impact on our lakes, especially since the 1940s as we used more commercial fertilizer, as equipment has become larger. Early logging really had very little impact, and the impacts it had were very short-lived. Shoreline development has increased nutrients, sediment delivery to the lakes, but we don't really see an increase in phosphorus in the lake water itself. The biggest impact has been habitat change. Habitat change along the shoreline and also aquatic macrophytes in the nearshore area. And climate change likely will have some important impacts on our lakes. We're not sure exactly what it might be, but as we've seen with Berry and Max Lakes, they can have profound changes. So if we have time, I can take a few questions. This is actually a picture from Irving Lake up in Vilas County. They have a lot of wild rice, which is what we see back here, and they had me take a sediment core to see if wild rice the abundance had changed over time. And it turned out this lake had very little wild rice before the 1960s. And then there was a big program to introduce wild rice, and this was apparently one of the lakes where they seeded wild rice.
All right. Questions? Let's go right here. And Carl will come around with the microphone too. If you guys don't mind, that way everybody can hear.
So it seems to me that your choice of location to take a sediment might be important due to multiple locations or some sort of grid over a lake before you start talking about what the lake did over time.
That's right. Typically, because I'm generally interested in general changes in the lake itself, not specific areas, we tend to take the core in the deepest area of the lake because that tends to integrate what's generally happened to the lake. We get the highest sedimentation rate in the deepest area. So by analyzing each section, we get better resolution. It might only have been deposited over 2 or 3 years. But typically we do take it from the deepest area. Now in the case of Green Lake, which is a long, narrow lake, we took it at 2 different locations, the east and west side of the lake. And if we have some bays that we're specifically interested in, we would take the core in the bay. But overall, we generally do it in the deep area of the lake.
And it's just one sample.
Frequently it's 1. In the case of Green Lake, we took 2, but typically we just do 1.
One core.
Yeah.
We're going to go to the back room here.
Hi, you mentioned that the community of Ripon was able to substantially reduce phosphorus into Green Lake by improving their waste or sewage treatment. How specifically did they do that?
I can't tell you for sure. I think they upgraded from primary to secondary. They may have diverted some of the effluent to other places, but I'm not real positive. Exactly everything they did.
With the shoreline development stuff that you touched on, do you see markers coming from septic and from coming out of private septic?
We generally don't unless if it came from an industrial process, there might be markers. But generally, that's too diffuse when it comes in to be able to tell. If there's only one septic system, maybe. I mean, one thing that you get from septic systems are chlorides, and diatoms are responsive to changes in chloride. I haven't specifically looked for impacts from septic systems, but that potentially was the way you could do it.
Yeah, you mentioned phosphorus runoff into lakes, and there's another source of potential phosphorus, and that is the internal recycling from the sediments on the bottom that are saturated with phosphorus under certain conditions. Is there a marker that you can look for that that internal recycling has occurred?
There's not a direct way to do that. The best way we can do that is, as I showed with Green Lake, we get a change in manganese concentration as a change in oxygen. And so if we see a change in manganese, that would indicate a loss of oxygen in the bottom waters. At the same time, phosphorus concentration would go up in the water. We can hypothesize that at least that's part of it. Quite often when that happens, there's other changes in the watershed that occur too. So sometimes it's difficult to tease exactly which of those is most significant. But primarily to answer your question, by looking at changes in oxygen in bottom waters, we can get an idea of that.
Wow. Yeah, follow-up, great.
Another question. So in the recent past, we've seen the influx of zebra mussels into the lakes. Is there a marker that you can look for to say when zebra mussels have overtaken a certain lake?
I haven't looked for that because they've been recent enough that people likely will actually have no data to show that. Potentially, you could look for parts of their shells in the sediments and see where they come in. I've not specifically done it, but that's probably the way you would do it.
Just on a very practical level, obviously freshwater is a huge worldwide issue and is a very significant issue for Wisconsin. So when you look at climate change projections, and you sort of touched on it when you were talking about the sand, et cetera. And I just would like to have a sort of layperson's understanding of how you see changes happening potentially here in Wisconsin with climate change.
Some of the models indicate that we'll get more intense rainfalls, and you could argue that's what we've seen in the last couple of years here as a result of climate change. If that happens, you may not necessarily get more rain in a year, but the fact that we get more intense rainstorms means that we get more pollutants, more phosphorus running in from this. Another change is that as the climate warms, lakes will have less ice cover, which means lakes like Mendota, deeper lakes, will have longer periods of stratification. And then, as this gentleman mentioned, you could get then more phosphorus coming out of the sediments. You could have more internal loading. That would be much more of an issue. There's also indications from the modeling that we'll see more droughts, more extreme weather, and certainly having droughts could impact lakes. I've worked some on a lake, Animal Lake up in Vilas County, that has a lot of water level fluctuations. It's a sea beast lake. In the case of that lake, it's sort of an intermediate in depth. And so typically, deeper lakes can handle phosphorus better than shallower lakes. In the case of Amble Lake, it's going from a deep lake to a shallow lake, so it mixes more frequently during the summer. And so that has raised the phosphorus levels and the algal levels in that lake. So that certainly those intermediate depth lakes, you can see that being much more common. Climate change.
Did any of your studies include checking for the buildup of dioxins in the water, especially since the use of herbicides began to increase, in agricultural use?
I have not looked for that in these courts. Some of the later materials they use now actually degrade fairly rapidly, once they're deposited, and so it's sometimes difficult to find those markers. There have been studies looked at that, but I have not done that.
Can you comment to what extent phosphorus that's in the sediment gets tied up in a non-soluble or poorly soluble mineral form?
So what the sediment indicates is that when phosphorus gets to the sediment, it combines with different chemicals within the sediment. For example, it might combine with calcium, it might combine with iron. If it combines with calcium, which often happens in hot water lakes like Mendota, it pretty much stays there. If it combines with iron, when in the presence of oxygen, iron and phosphorus are insoluble. They stay in the sediments. But when you lose oxygen in the bottom waters, iron changes to a form that's soluble. So essentially then the iron comes out of the sediments, and when the iron comes out, the phosphorus comes out. So in those cases, especially if you see this more in saltwater lakes, you get a lot more phosphorus than coming out of the sediments. Harder water lakes like Mendota, lakes in southern and central part of the state have more calcium. They certainly get iron, phosphorus coming out of the sediments, but more of that phosphorus gets tied up with calcium in these harder water lakes.
Any other questions? All right, Paul, I want to thank you one more time for a reminder, next month we'll be here on Monday the Third. Upstairs, Women in Water, there's information on your table tents as well. If you'd like to volunteer at Frozen Assets out on the ice, gonna have ice. It's a real fun community engagement opportunity, and that date is February 8th, and you can see any of us in the logo stuff about that. So thanks, and have a great day.